Hello, everyone. My name is Terry Robinson, and I'm the Executive Editor for SC Media. Welcome to our webcast, Tackling the Risks of Open Source Security, 5 Things Every CISO Needs to Know, sponsored by WhiteSource. Open source has become the key building block for application development in today's market, where companies are under constant pressure to accelerate time to market. The increasing adoption of open source components, however, has introduced new security challenges that most teams are not prepared to mitigate in their current posture. In this webinar, we're going to present 5 approaches and best practices that security teams should implement in order to enable their developers to harness the power of open source without slowing them down or compromising on security. Our speaker today is Rami Elron, Senior Director of Product Management at WhiteSource. Rami has more than 25 years of experience in companies such as IBM, BMC Software, and more, thereby directing large-scale projects and driving successful customer-facing engagement in data security, data storage, data science, product management, and business strategy. In addition, Rami is an acclaimed presenter and co-author of several books and international security-related standards. He is well-versed in this industry, and I'd like to welcome him today. Hi, Rami. Welcome.
Thank you. And hello to everyone on the call. In the past few years, many new companies have surfaced that are technology-oriented, and they drive an unprecedented focus on technologies that are believed to accelerate productivity. This is, along with many other organizations that exhibit a strong inclination to adopt such technologies. Now, the emergence of advanced connectivity, communications, the incredible amounts of data being generated and consumed, the relative ease by which data attacks can be launched, and importantly, an ever-growing proliferation of endpoints, I would say that they serve collectively as a major reason for the changing threat space and the effect that such change has on business. With the growing attention to security risks in general and perhaps data breaches in particular, the organizational culture is changing. In an attempt to cope as best as possible with the challenges that are posed by these risks, we are going to touch upon some of the items that the customers, that businesses are dealing with. Now, unfortunately, the attempt to cope with those challenges, it often struggles to exhibit awareness to the changed culture and attain collaboration among teams that is effective enough to maintain agility and also leverage novel tools in a way that can realize better collaboration. Now, given the topic that we have at hand, the CISO has a critical role in this landscape. Security today has more board visibility than ever, and the CISO has an unprecedented opportunity to establish a program that is believed to deal effectively with such challenges. The role has today also more responsibilities than ever, and is therefore probably better than ever equipped to accommodate the requirements that the business is facing. As that role has transformed over the years and became a business role with a strong focus on asset protection and risk management, it is perhaps highly advantageous for the CISO to explore possible ways that can help teams not just do what they were expected to do, but also enable themselves and collectively satisfy a requirement for maximized productivity. All of that while accommodating the security goals that were set forth. That is precisely what this session sets out to cover. Granted, singling out 5 things for our session is a challenge in itself, especially given the multitude and the criticality of so many security facets. The different parts of this session do span, however, critical aspects, and they take into account the CISO role potential, not just the role, but the role potential to facilitate processes that can align security requirements with the business objectives. I would say that realizing the benefits that are commonly attributed to security within agile development, they can be daunting. And they are challenging, and they often compel both technology and business leaders to reconsider traditional approaches possibly employed. And this will potentially call for a different and even a new mindset that I will touch upon later on. I therefore intend to highlight during this session select strategies and insights that are believed to help companies address the challenges that are posed by open source security in an effective manner that can yield, I would say, a maximized productivity business value. So without further ado, let's please move on to the next slide and what is essentially our first part. The first part highlights the rising significance of open source, and it intends to highlight select risks that are attributed to open source software development. In this particular part, I will present a quick overview of select open source software security aspects that are associated with the development lifecycle in general, and also with the agile development lifecycle in particular. It is important to note, and this is a perfect point to bring up this topic, that perhaps too many people treat security as a feature rather than an attribute or a characteristic that permeates throughout the application. It is important to acknowledge that the implementation of security affects and is affected by other system aspects, and this is going to be a point that I will touch upon in various places throughout this presentation. So let's now move to the next slide, which is a graphic. So here's an understatement to start with. Not all companies are accommodating the requirements that are driven by the digital transformation in the most effective manner. Digital transformation reflects the change that digital technology imposes on, any aspects that are associated to our society. Security is arguably one of the more critical consequences of the changes that are encountered. And what we can see and what we're going to focus on in this slide are several points. We will see a significant gap that is between a perception and the effective results that many organizations are encountering. And we will also see how lacking visibility into the application environment can essentially affect not just the decisions, but the plans that lead to some decisions. But let's start out with something that is a bit more general in concept. Information security in particular has been constantly increasing in importance as well as in expenditure over the recent years. And this has largely been reflecting it has reflected the growing awareness by technology leaders and decision makers to what I would simply call an unprecedented business impact of data breaches, as well as other perhaps more general security incidents. Nonetheless, many companies are not very successful in their attempt to safeguard data, and that is despite an increased spending on security. This is a phenomenon, and this phenomenon is noted in various studies by analysts and market observers, and it highlights, and this is important, it highlights a substantial gap, the one I mentioned a moment earlier. The gap between what some may see as the perceived effectiveness of security spending versus the evidenced effects. One could assert that not all companies are accommodating the requirements driven by the digital transformation in the most responsible manner. And responsibility is a very important word throughout this presentation. What spending shows? Well, it shows one angle of a potential problem, but it is illuminative nonetheless, and it reveals findings that often lead to interesting insights and questions, especially when highlighting a gap between security risks and the allocation of spending. That gap is reflected in the it is reflected in the presented slide for application security, and it shows high annual investment relative to endpoints, to data, and to servers. It also underscores an attributed risk factor that perhaps edges out all other areas that are depicted, networks included. But that said, given the high percentage, according to some studies at least, and that is over 75% perhaps, of cyber attacks that are taking place at the application layer, and I would add to that, while increasingly being acknowledged as a primary target for attacks, the organization focus on application security, and I guess you can see that as well, it doesn't really seem to reflect a commensurate level of priority, at least not spending-wise. Now, studies indicate that the number of data breaches in global enterprises is growing, sometimes despite extended spending on security, as was noted already. Moreover, the increasing adoption of advanced digital transformation technologies, and this includes the data analytics, mobile technologies, cloud services, IoT, all of that, they actually appear to exacerbate the risk, since what I would call a burgeoning impetus exhibited by customers to employ the latest technologies, that has even widened security attack surfaces. And this serves as yet another indicator of the alarming state of security, or lack thereof. It might also suggest that organizations should actually re-examine expenditure preferences versus the results, and perhaps, potentially, they should revisit their traditional mindset. This is largely because a shift in spending might adversely affect the effectiveness of processes that are already established, and it will call for adjustments that counter such an effect. It's therefore imperative, in my opinion, to examine spending not just in the context of tools, but the factor how pertinent processes are affected. We will see later into this session with regard to application security more details that this comes into play. I also think that application security is predicted to garner even more attention than what has already been described with the imminent arrival of GDPR. GDPR is widely regarded as a cardinal driver for a sizable portion of decision-making that will take place in the next year. Last for this slide, but definitely not least, the significance of application security may be particularly observed with the extraordinary popularity of open source software. And this is a great preamble for our next slide. So to explore some reasons for the significance, let's now please move on to the next slide. So a few words about the open source world, the open source market. There is a highly competitive marketplace out there, and it compels organizations to accelerate the delivery of products that are expected to be valuable, reliable, and unsurprisingly secure. To that end, open source is claimed to have essentially transformed, and even, I would go as far as to say, revolutionized the software development industry. And it did so by enabling developers to deliver potent and valuable applications, and importantly, faster than ever. Proving to be extremely cost-effective didn't hurt either. Unsurprisingly, open source components are believed to account today for a considerable portion of software solutions, with 60 to 80% being a common quote. Moreover, the adoption of open source has been exhibiting a staggering growth rate, and industry giants reportedly are becoming strong adopters of open source development as well as usage. These results show that adoption rates may seem very different depending on the role being asked as well. You may ask a leader or a developer and get different results, get different observations regarding the adoption rate. And despite the number of applications considered to comprise a high percentage of open source and third-party components, it has been shown that managers are not necessarily aware of the actual usage of open source by their developers. Not that they're totally unaware, but they are not necessarily aware of the actual intensity of that usage. And as a result, when you observe some of the results that were presented by polls, you'll get different results, and that might surprise. This is actually extremely problematic, as it might result in what may be called an inappropriate assessment by leaders, by decision makers, the assessment of the potential security risks that are associated with that usage. And I think that it will also result in an inappropriate appraisal of any steps that are possibly warranted in order to maximize the effectiveness of a security program. Now, with regard to the CISO's responsibilities, I think everyone would agree that data breach readiness, data breach organization readiness is one of the most critical responsibilities. After all, the increasing rates of very well-known breaches, especially in the past couple of years, this made enterprises worldwide highly aware of the risks to important organization facets, especially the image, the trust, the credibility, that this impact comes from all of those data attacks. And as a result, organizations often no longer accept security measures to be a mere representative or mere ingredient of the development approach that is being employed, but rather a cornerstone, nothing less, of the complete life cycle, the complete software development life cycle. One of the indicators that easily demonstrate how seriously the risk needs to be taken is the number of reported vulnerabilities. And to get a better picture of that, let's now please advance to the next slide. So there are a few top points that I would like to highlight while we're observing the details that are depicted here. Not necessarily in an order of significance, I would like to touch upon the growing number of vulnerabilities that perhaps aside from indicating the gravity of the challenge, they also, and this is perhaps a bit ironic, they also indicate a certain level of ease by which many can possibly accommodate the concern. They can easily identify vulnerabilities, they can update components, so this is one aspect. Another aspect is, and it's a good takeaway as well, it concerns the growing number of vulnerabilities, which in itself reflects a growing involvement to test and to review. There is also a significance of certain things that are helpful when dealing with this rising number of vulnerabilities, such as a comprehensive database of knowledge, and a significance of automation that I will also touch upon. Finally, and I will keep a bookmark next to this because this actually gets elaborated further on and has its own dedicated section in this presentation, is the significance of determining not only what are the reported vulnerabilities, but, and this is interesting, which vulnerabilities we are actually exposed to. So, as in order to address the items that I just mentioned, let us quickly go through some quick points. Known security vulnerabilities are often highlighted as an alarming risk for data attacks and actually for security threats in general. The growth, well, let me say it differently. While the growth of open source popularity has resulted in a higher security awareness, it also underscores a need for better processes and better best practices than organizations have been typically relying on and have been employing. Importantly, the growth of open source usage has compelled many companies to turn to automated tools. They do so for management, for tracking, for reporting on software components, especially with known security vulnerabilities. Now, the reported number of vulnerabilities, I think it indicates that the number of CVEs, well, it's pretty obvious that it is in a continued rise. And this essentially makes 2017 the record holder, the dubious honor of the record holder for the highest number of annually reported vulnerabilities. Above all, it reflects this rise. It reflects a potential for compromised applications, data breaches, but it also signifies the requirement to consistently check projects against an up-to-date listing of security vulnerabilities, and the up-to-date listing needs to be aggregated from publicly available sources, such as the NVD. The purpose of this particular slide was not to open a large topic of discussion, which will be discussed later on, but this part highlighted the rising significance of open source along with risks that are attributed to software development. So in order to discuss what I dubbed the mindset change that is warranted to accommodate these challenges, let's please move on to the next slide. There are many things that experience can teach us, but if there is anything that I would highlight at this moment in time, it is that in the past years, development preferences are not necessarily clustering around a single approach. And this applies to security as well. Organizations do not employ the same approach for security, nor do they play the same according to the same I would say standard book and place the level of attention to security criticality, procedure review, allocation of responsibility, and more. What I would like to do in this section, is to explore why open source security is a different game and why it requires to change the mindset. Now, before we do so, there is an aspect I would like to touch upon that is not highlighted, perhaps as clearly as I would hope for. As already noted, organizations are increasingly realizing that despite the many advantages of open source, there are new or perhaps not new but adjusted practices that need to be considered in order to reap those advantages. The significance of such a consideration is further pronounced when security is compared to other important open source aspects for consideration, namely quality. The relationship between component security and quality raises several aspects that should rank very highly in the organization checklist for open source security. The popularity of a project, for instance, the level of activity, and the organization community as well. Some recent cases of discovered security vulnerabilities indicated that the popularity of the project or a component should not necessarily be taken as a sole testament to its quality or security. The level of activity can serve as a better measure. Well, it can many times serve as a better measure of quality. So in the aftermath of the well-publicized security incidents of late, it became quite evident that the importance of open source component quality, again, quality, not just security, it cannot be over-exaggerated. So with that, I would like to ask to move to the next slide. And this slide has some interesting top points. The table itself that is seen highlights some salient characteristics that are associated with open source vulnerabilities and some related tools that may be used. There are some points that need to be emphasized here. I don't want to read the table, it's unnecessary, but I definitely wish to highlight some of the items that are presented here. One is the detection of open source vulnerabilities that concerns known vulnerabilities. And this is in contrast with what we can see on the left-hand side where SAST or DAST present other options. If we talk about SAST, or white box testing as some treated, it inspects the source code of the application, and it can detect potential vulnerabilities. The DAST, on the other hand, or black box testing, as some call it, it examines the application during runtime, and this is in a way that may be similar or can mimic an attack from outside of the application. Now, these aspects are very important, but they might not necessarily be easy enough to integrate into the CI/CD process. And this is one aspect that I will also address very soon. Another item that I would like to touch upon here is that all information is publicly available when you look at the right-hand side of the table. The visibility really helps maximize the ability to inspect and analyze the code, discover issues, and also suggest a fix. In addition to that, published open source vulnerabilities may also and likely also have actionable remediation, which is very important. And lastly, one of the more significant value points is the ability to establish continuous monitoring for vulnerabilities, which includes also the point in time after the release. There are obviously additional important points that need to be stressed here. I would like to very quickly touch upon a couple of them. One is that the open source vulnerabilities can essentially be discovered even years after a component has been already released to the market. And as a result, one needs to continuously monitor status and look for any news concerning vulnerabilities that are found. There is also an important takeaway that I would like to point at, and it is that one cannot really manage a proprietary code in the same way that we used to manage security. Well, perhaps even contrasting proprietary code and open source security. There are also some good news here, but well, I think that I can comment that the good news really is that there is a significant percentage of open source vulnerabilities that have fixes, and this is therefore imperative to closely listen to the community in this regard, because the community has a very high incentive to provide alerts, to provide fixes, and released updates as well. With that, I would like to ask to move to the next slide. So this starts really a new section, and this is an interesting concept that I alluded to earlier, namely the ability to potentially improve our focus by trimming non-critical aspects throughout the development lifecycle. In order to fully understand what this is really all about, let's move to the next slide. So this slide looks pretty simple, but it actually presents something that might not be as obvious. In order to attain the development process agility that many hope for, it's advantageous to minimize the overhead through prioritization, through effective task prioritization, but also objectives, not just the tasks themselves. How really can one determine what is an effective way of prioritization? Well, one way is to regard effective prioritization as strongly dependent on the ability to accurately associate a qualitative, perhaps better yet, a quantitative weighting to the target, the target of prioritization, obviously. It's important to consider something here, and that is that if the prioritization is based not on reported library vulnerabilities, but based on vulnerabilities that are verified to be effectively referenced by user code, it would be probably much, much better. And this is an attractive proposition, a really attractive proposition. Given that there is a high severity score that is reported for many vulnerabilities, it may not really be feasible or easy in any way to effectively prioritize a handling of security vulnerabilities. However, relying on the reported vulnerability score as the sole metric for vulnerability prioritization is, well, it's less than optimal, since in practice the user code, the user code that actually potentially references such components, it may not necessarily include actual references to vulnerabilities that are featured potentially in libraries, any vulnerable library entities. This can have significant consequences. It can save a sizable portion of development time, and that development time can be then relegated to more valuable objectives, those that are deemed valuable by the business, obviously. This happens since the overall total effort that would otherwise be warranted to address the reported open source security vulnerabilities may be potentially reduced in a very substantial way. Let's now move to the next slide. I think that with regard to the progress thus far, we can say that the previous topic really gave us a chance to explore potential for process effectiveness. So in the following case, and in the one later on, I will present how the product lifecycle timeframe can actually be utilized not just more effectively, but more efficiently. And there are a few top points here that we will touch upon. One concerns the question of responsibility. I mentioned responsibility earlier on, and I noticed that I noted that there are going to be several points throughout the presentation where we will repeat that, and we will discuss some related facets. So in this case, I would say that cyber and application security should not, and in practice, they will normally not be the responsibility of a sole person or a sole team for that matter. There is also a sizable gap between the acknowledged importance of policies and practices and the actual implementation of such practices throughout the organizations. Now, a question that I would like to ask here is actually, who owns security? Before we move on to the next slide, something I would like to quickly address. Who actually owns security? Is it developers? Is it development managers, DevOps, anyone? Well, the anyone is not really misplaced, because part of the problem is really that there is no agreed upon approach for answering such a question, or a preference for that matter. Any tool that would be considered to accommodate needs that are related to the topic at hand would therefore need to be able to accommodate also user preferences for security, and not just security, but for policy use cases. Organizations should, as a result, be able to easily employ both workflows and also any procedures that would allow to adjust them as they realize a need for change. Another question that I would ask is, how critical is ongoing risk assessment awareness? Risk, and this is another item that is being touched upon later as well, risk should not really be assessed at any single point in time. It should be a continuous process. Nonetheless, many organizations have frankly not employed such a process for risk assessment due to a variety of reasons. So in order to fully understand, or perhaps not fully, but at least to better understand, acknowledge some of the not the concerns, but some of the ways that we can improve on the processes that are used throughout the security development, the development lifecycle, let's move on to the next slide and see some focus on automation. Establishing a program that fosters not just collaboration, but true collaboration between teams is very critical. for the business in general and for the CISO to attain any goals that, they could assuage board concerns and they would maximize the potential for business growth. Unfortunately, in many cases, there is limited collaboration that was encountered and acknowledged between application development and security teams. And, it's a reflection of the processes or the lack of the processes that take place. The typical FTE ratio between organization teams, I think, highlights a key challenge that the security teams and the development teams are facing. Well, the challenge actually facing an effective security implementation program in general, how to drive security effectively without introducing what some people call friction among teams. This friction stems from a raft of sources, including ownership issues, prioritization differences, and in order to achieve such a goal, it is pretty imperative to focus on several key facets. One would be understanding the organizational culture, and more specifically, who can do what. Another thing would be to incorporate security in the development lifecycle. And the third would be to drive automated processes. Let me expand on that. With regard to automation, it is important to establish a process that is not too person-specific, and in a moment I will explain. Most importantly, it is critical to automate a process that can help create a best practice feedback loop. And now let me explain. The lack of a right automation, it is a serious issue that plagues the attempts of many organizations to streamline procedures. The right automation would suggest that the process can and also should change based on continuous feedback. It's therefore imperative to feature some tools that can be easily tailored to accommodate such change, rather than establishing and then enforcing a process simply because it is believed by some to be warranted. As we noted earlier, cyber and application security should not, and in practice will normally not be the responsibility of any sole entity, whether it's a person or a team. A process that can effectively address security throughout the software development lifecycle should require an appointment of a representative in each department that is expected to collaborate on such a lifecycle with the organization's security administration. Another point that was noted earlier, and I would like to expand on, is the gap between the acknowledged importance of security policies and practices and the actual implementation of such practices throughout the organization. It's absolutely imperative to empower the development teams with the ability to promote, to rationalize, and I would even dare saying drive security-related processes that are based on a collaborative discussion and the usage of tools that allow the team to both address and mitigate potential security risks before they become such. One way to do so is to encourage the organization to review processes for component selection that would establish proposed best practices based on development experience. Another thing would be to incorporate tools that facilitate a selection process of components. That would help the developer identify known vulnerabilities rather than facing a situation later to encounter the consequences of deploying a vulnerable component in code. And finally, there is a need to automate the process, as was mentioned. There is one more thing, and it's rather critical to pay some attention here. The organization should strive to attain shared ownership. This, I know, may be a bit problematic, and many people prefer to say delegation per se. I'm saying delegation because we're just about to touch upon the context of the delegation. But I mentioned specifically ownership because I think that by promoting collaboration early in the process, this is actually possible. And I think also that it is crucial to do so early in the process, because at that point in time, it's easier to address the essential composition and rationale, what some people refer to as the what and the why, and how they are laid out. And it should be done well before any procedure, or what some people call the how, and the establishment of such a procedure. Part of the collaboration is required to realize a process that will outline the nature of the how, the nature of the procedure, rather than enforcing it. And this is one of the key attributes believed to characterize the, well, I will say the evolved role of a CISO. Smaller teams can help support larger teams without inducing any friction by providing training, by participating in development processes, and by delegation of authority. Now, with that regard, let's please move on to the next slide, and we'll elaborate a bit on that very last comment. So, it is strongly believed that the security team must not need to get out of the way of the development team in order for development to implement an agile process. And this might seem challenging. So I have here a side comment. In Latin, the expression fides facit fidem is a way of saying confidence begets confidence. And delegation is an advanced, evolved form of collaboration that encompasses, in my opinion, objective sharing and concerted operations. Security personnel, they should strongly consider empowering engineering by delegating the responsibility to establish practices that can help push forward, can actually help catapult productivity and streamline security procedures. And even more importantly, the organization must endeavor to accommodate user preferences for practices that are established in cooperation rather than being dictated. And by doing so, focusing the attention at opportunities that foster innovation and creativity. Now, the next sentence may be a bit big, but by turning developers into security advocates, the CISO really becomes more than a mere agent of change. Well, not mere, but an agent of change, but rather a facilitator of business opportunity. And this is really what we are trying to accomplish with many of the messages that are being presented throughout this presentation. Let's please advance to the next slide, where we will cover the last aspect that is detailed here in this session. This is really about what is called shift left. Shift left is about integrating evaluative practices, and not just testing, into the software lifecycle, and by doing so, detecting defects and risk potential as early as possible. As with the previous topic, this topic allows us to explore a potential for higher process efficiency. Shift left is warranted due to many things, but I think that in particular an ever-growing need for faster software releases. It is also applicable to testing of proprietary code, but it should be applicable to open source as well. And it is very pronounced in that context. Early detection obviously enables early corrective actions, and this is really what we're going to expand on in a moment. But just before we move on, a very small comment here. This shift-left approach enables early attention to security within the product lifecycle, and it helps teams accelerate delivery by minimizing the overhead. From a security standpoint, the earlier that a security issue is described in the development cycle, it is quicker, it is easier, and it is much cheaper to fix. With that said, let's now move on to the next slide. So the next slide highlights that the cost of fixing security and quality issues is rising significantly as you move from one stage to another throughout the life cycle. let's highlight, or perhaps let's discuss in a bit more detail some of the aspects here. And let me perhaps present that by virtue of a question. How can a shift-left approach help open source productivity? Well, first and foremost, it fosters better agility. Not only can security align well with agile objectives, shifting the team's focus to certain security product aspects, it will even improve upon process agility, as is reflected in component selection and approval processes. Early component selection can flag components that are identified as being vulnerable. Please note that the appropriate way to do component selection is required in order to encompass appropriate measures to ensure safety, as well as compliance with organizational security policies. This includes a proper approval process, even if it might not necessarily eliminate this thing, because issues may be discovered at a later stage. As a result, potential security problems may be mitigated instead of warranting unnecessary attention at a later stage, as I already mentioned earlier. Now let's please move on to the next slide. The top question here is really how the shift-left approach can not only help open source productivity, but actually add value to the development process. An important derivative of such an approach is the ability to establish a corporate policy for component selection and approval, not just the selection obviously only, and by doing both, it will leverage the combined experience of multiple organizational teams. This is something that appears to be very helpful with organizations. They just get to acknowledge the value of having, I would call it, placeholders for discussing some of the areas that perhaps may call for attention at a later phase, but addressing them early enough. In the more traditional approaches for software development, this was a definite no-go. And I personally experienced situations where a strong interest in certain features that simply did not strike a bell with a significant enough number of other people, it turned out to be something that was not even included as part of the design. And I consider such a thing to be very unfortunate. And given the agile processes of late, it is far easier to convince, and to actually, it's not about convincing, it's really about collaborating with people in the development, in security, and considering the short sprints, the relatively short sprints, and the opportunity to introduce and reintroduce ideas. This is something that is extremely significant and is very strongly aligned with the whole notion and value proposition of the shift left. In addition to that, integrating component selection and approval as early as possible, it extends the period that is given to the security team to work together with the development team and to establish a process that may be, just may be, better tailored to leverage the team's preference. That could be aligned better with other teams across the organization. And I think that by leveraging the experience and feeding it back to the product development lifecycle, it would be possible to promote aspects of the product that, as I mentioned earlier in a slightly different context, are simply much less possible, less viable, and I already commented that this might be unfortunate. I very much believe in that statement. So with that said, let's please advance to the next slide. This is aimed to be something of a final note. It's not really the final note, but it is a key message to think differently when it comes to processes. And there are a few top points that I would like to make here. First, there is a critical perception gap between the point of view of leaders and developers. We referenced that briefly earlier, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. In addition, one must keep in mind that there is no single solution for security issues. There are multiple solutions, there are multiple approaches. Multiple is not mentioned in the context of rivaling solutions. They need to be considered as complementary. And the whole idea of complementing a certain solution with another approach is something that I believe more and more leaders are beginning to appreciate and definitely to acknowledge. In addition to that, addressing the security problem or the security challenge is definitely a combination of a tool set and a mindset. It's not just one of those. In order to promote a better way to treat security issues and to implement a process that will not thwart any attempts for agility and will also maintain the expected results security-wise, it is incredibly important to know the inventory that is used by the organization. It is important to consider very seriously how security can contribute to the process of development, and it is also extremely important to know better the code that is being used, where software composition analysis can be extremely helpful in that regard. Recent events or upcoming events such as the imminent applicability of regulations such as GDPR could be, and this might sound a bit surprising, could prove to be a treasure trove of best practices for open source as well, because many of the recommendations that are associated with preparation for such an imminent requirement, such as improving the effectiveness of processes, delegation of select security authorities, and even shift left, are well aligned with the requirements that are normally mentioned with regard to the ability to satisfy such requirements for regulations and also business objectives. And with that, let's please move to our, well, essentially the last slide on this presentation. As was noted already in an earlier part, security has much more board visibility than ever. And the CISO has an unprecedented opportunity to establish a program that will deal effectively with these challenges. The CISO, or perhaps better put, the CISO's role is today with many more responsibilities than ever. And the CISO is therefore better than ever equipped, it is definitely believed that role to be better than ever equipped to accommodate the requirements that the business is facing. Now, as this role transformed over the years into something that is much more of a business role and has a strong focus on risk management, it is extremely advantageous for that role to explore possible ways that will not only maintain a security, the required security posture, but ways to help teams enable themselves and collectively satisfy our requirement, not just for security, but for maximized productivity as well. In the last hour or so, we've reviewed the salient aspects of the changing technology and business landscape. We've also reviewed the significance of the evolving role of the CISO, and we've touched upon critical aspects of open source security along with related processes that consider the potential for the CISO to facilitate. It's important to align those business objectives with security requirements, obviously. But the more important thing is that the challenging journey to realize the benefits that are attributed to security in the environment that we're talking about, the agile environment, they are believed to warrant a new mindset. The new mindset is required for security in general, but for security tools and processes in particular. For that reason, the session, this whole presentation highlighted select strategies and insights that were believed to help the companies and help the leadership in particular to embrace the opportunity that is presented by open source security and yield the productivity, the benefits that were noted. So here is a quick listing of the main recommendations and salient arguments that were made. Let's first start with the prioritized security vulnerability. So our first recommendation or our first argument concerns implementation of an analysis to enable prioritized security vulnerability, and by doing so, drive an improved open source vulnerability remediation process. Attaining a security conscious mindset within such a life cycle is not a fictitious proposition, as long as ample attention is placed in an attempt to reduce overhead. The effective prioritization of vulnerabilities will help organizations refrain from a dependence on the reported severity scores, and it will also abet their ability to extend development bandwidth. The next recommendation is about streamlining processes. Collaboration today is not really an option. It's a must. Collaboration should help the security team empower the development team to enable themselves. Delegation is a key aspect of such collaboration, and it can facilitate easy appraisal of the vulnerability risk within the continuous integration process, the continuous integration development process. Finally, it is recommended to employ a shift-left approach for security and for other aspects of development that concern open source, such as quality, in order to facilitate better practices. A shift-left approach can help organizations mitigate the risk. It will accelerate time to value by minimizing potential for vulnerabilities, but perhaps even more importantly, and this is a good way to reach a closure on this session, it can also facilitate collaborative work of the security and development teams, and this will enable the working processes that are much better aligned with the organizational goals and much better poised to maximize productivity. This really concludes the session, so thank you very much.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for your insights, Rami. And now we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. Can you please clarify the 70% passive versus effective statistic discussed in your presentation?
So the statistic was presented as a way to highlight the potential advantages that lie in the ability to identify areas where the actual code is referencing vulnerabilities, because the early studies seem to indicate that a large percentage, over 2/3, which is the 70%, over 2/3 of cases may be those where the code does not actually make explicit references to areas that were identified as vulnerable. Now, this has some great consequences. One of those consequences is that one could better prioritize the usage, could prioritize the way to address issues that would normally concern vulnerabilities with open source components, because without such an insight, it would be rather difficult to state that one should address one vulnerability over the other. This provides yet another way to perhaps suggest that some vulnerabilities, while they are reported explicitly and well known, they might not require the same level of attention when you just need to prioritize, because you simply cannot handle everything. Bandwidth does not allow for that. So I hope that the answer addressed the question, but just to summarize, the idea is that based on early studies, it might be possible to reduce significantly the overhead, the effort that is normally and otherwise required to attend security vulnerabilities that are only reported and not verified to be associated with explicit reference calls.
Okay, here's one more. Why has incorporating security into the dev lifecycle been regarded as so challenging?
I think that Well, first, there are a variety of reasons, really. One of the common reasons that is something that I would highlight is that there is a different point of view that was expressed by security experts and by developers with regard to product security objectives in general and the criticality that is associated with those objectives in particular. In addition, the right prioritization, I stress right, the right prioritization warranted to accommodate pertinent needs, it proved to be a central cause for debate. And some observers have alluded, which is something I believe I noted throughout the presentation, they alluded to a sense of friction encountered between security and development teams. So I would say that it is quite conceivable that the inability to easily reach an agreement or even a compromise concerning security aspects often resulted in friction. So, but nonetheless, I think it has in any case definitely contributed to the notion that incorporating security conscious thinking within the DevOps development lifecycle is very challenging.
Okay, great. Well, that's going to have to be it for this session. Just a reminder that this webcast will be available on demand beginning tomorrow on scmagazine.com in our events section. Thank you for being here with us today, Rami, and of course, thanks to everyone for tuning in.
Thank you.